I really want to thank you for coming out to see us this afternoon. We know December is a very busy time. I don't think there's a Macy's one-day sale, so it's great to see you all. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I am the Government Affairs Director at Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, and we want to thank you for joining us. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in Sacramento and San Francisco. PPIC has just released a new report entitled New Insights into California's Arrests, Trends, Disparities, and County Differences, authored by researchers Magnus Lofstrom, Brandon Martin, Dustin Goss, Joe Hayes, and Stephen Raphael, the elusive Stephen Raphael, I want to say. The other authors are here today. We'd like to thank the Laura and John Arnold Foundation for their support of this work and this event, including our lunch today. You should have received a copy of the report on your chair along with just the fact sheets on arrests in California. There are additional copies at the registration desk. The report, the fact sheets, the technical appendix, and slides from today's presentations are also online at ppic.org. For today's program, we're going to first hear from Magnus Lofstrom, who will present the main findings of the report. Then Brandon Martin will moderate a discussion with a fantastic panel. We thank them for coming. These experts here will provide some really interesting and important insights. And finally, you'll have time for questions and answers. You should have received an agenda on your chair and all the speakers' bios on the back side. So in the interest of time, we won't be doing detailed introductions later today. And please note that we also have an online audience, so when you are asking a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you. A couple of things before we begin. Later today, you'll receive a short survey. We love our surveys, so I really appreciate your response. We do read them, and it does help us make our events better. And lastly, please turn off your cell phones. Crime is a very emotional thing. One can't understate the impact on victims, their families, and their communities. People generally often respond to crime and put it in the context of how it affected them and their families and how they would feel if that crime happened to them. But there's another side of the criminal justice debate. High-profile cases in the nation and here in California have raised questions about the fairness of our criminal justice system. The concerns about victims, safety, and fairness are all very emotional issues. And this means that crime is also a very political topic in our country, because when people react strongly to an issue, sadly, it makes for the best political ads. For good-willed people of all political persuasion, this makes conversation around criminal justice issues very difficult. So it is important in this type of environment to find common facts, things people can agree on. Today's report is a part of a 2-year project with the goal of putting out facts on arrests in California. We have this report, we have a technical appendix for people who really like data, and it's very rich in data. And we have a new online tool that I really would commend to you. Additionally, as part of this project, we have an advisory group. This advisory group consists of law enforcement and community reform advocates and researchers. And I'm happy to report they have found a lot of common ground. They all wanted safe communities and an equitable justice system. They all agreed that for law enforcement to be effective, they must have the trust of communities. I'm not going to say they agreed on everything, but I was really heartened by the conversations we had at our working group. They asked each other very detailed questions and provided really insightful answers. We really want to thank them for the committee members from taking their time to participate in this important project. We know it's not an easy project or topic, and we know you have important jobs to do as well. Magnus will talk a little bit more about the scope of this project in his presentation, but I wanted to leave you with our hope. It is our hope that the facts we present in this report and in our next report coming out this next summer provides a constructive dialogue on criminal justice issues in California, and that the dialogue leads to a fair system that makes us all safer. And with that, I'd like to introduce Magnus Lofstrom. He is a policy director of corrections and a senior fellow at PPIC focusing on crime rates and recidivism. Welcome, Magnus.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for coming here today to give us this opportunity to share with you our newest report on a topic that is new to us, where we're focusing on the first step of the criminal justice process, arrests. And I think it's safe to say that we're all aware of the heated discussions about crime, policing, and community relations, especially around law enforcement and tensions with some of the minority communities. And it is really, this is primarily in the context of arrests. And while arrests are really based in California's criminal laws and determined by the state's legislature as well as voters, there is considerable discretion for law enforcement around arrests. And maybe surprisingly, this is something that is not closely monitored by the state. And it's surprising, especially if you look at the numbers of arrests that take place in California in the most recent year that we have data for. It's more than 1.3 million arrests. So our goals here in this project, it's a 2-year project. This is the first report. Part of that is really to answer some of the key questions around arrest. We want to shed light on how arrests have changed over time in terms of the offenses that individuals are arrested for, as well as the demographics of those arrested. And an important part of this project is also looking at how those things differ across the various jurisdictions in California. The goal is to create as Deborah pointed out, a shared understanding of the facts based on the best data available. The data are not perfect, but we think this is very suitable data for addressing the kinds of questions that we're focusing on here. It is the best available data. And we want to use that to frame constructive solutions-oriented discussions. What do we see in these data? So I want to go and run through some of the key findings, and there are a number of stats that I'll be sharing with you here, so bear with me. Luckily, we have this panel coming up after me that will provide additional context to what we're seeing in these data and around this issue of arrests. So we have seen a dramatic drop in arrests in California over the last few decades. The arrest rate, the number of arrests per 100,000 residents, have dropped from over 8,000 in the late 1980s to about 3,400 in 2016. It's a drop by about 58%, and arrests are now at the lowest rate that we've observed over this 37-year period that we are looking at here, which is from 1980 through 2016. So the question is, what are the types of offenses that are behind these trends, and are there differences in the demographics of those arrested over this period as well? So I'm going to start by breaking it down by misdemeanors and felonies, focusing first on what are the trends in terms of misdemeanors, the low-level offenses, and then we'll move on to felonies. And then I'll talk about the demographic changes before discussing county differences. And what we see here is certainly that misdemeanor arrests have changed dramatically. And it's really a big part of the decline in arrests in California is driven by misdemeanors. It's about 3/4 of that drop, significant drop, is in misdemeanor arrests. And this might be not terribly surprising because misdemeanor arrest is really the majority of arrests as well. And if we look at between 1990 and through 2014, between 66 and 70% of all arrests were for these lower level offenses for misdemeanor arrests. There's one thing that I want to point out. We do see a notable change starting with the introduction of Prop 47, which reclassified a number of drug and property offenses from felonies or wobblers to misdemeanors. So right after Prop 47 was passed, the share of misdemeanor arrests increased to 74%. In terms of that longer-term decrease in misdemeanor arrests, that's really driven by decreases in traffic and alcohol-related offenses. We do see that misdemeanor drug arrests went up after Prop 47. That is not surprising given the reclassification. But we don't see really much of a change in misdemeanor property arrests right after Prop 47. If we switch over to looking at felony arrests, we've seen some big changes here as well. And felony arrest accounts then for the other quarter of the decrease in arrests in California. And the types of offenses that stands out amongst felonies are, first of all, it's property arrests. We see a very notable decrease in the arrest rate for felony property offenses from about 750 in the early 1980s to about 190 in 2016. And as a result of this sharp decrease, felony property arrests are now a much smaller share of all felony arrests. It's dropped from 45% to 21%. We see also big changes in felony drug arrests has come down sharply. It went from about 600 in the late 1980s to about 100 in 2016. And then similarly that the share of drug arrests among felonies has also dropped from about 24% to 11%. Today, the offense group, the largest offense group amongst felonies are actually for violent offenses. That accounts for 1/3 of felony arrests in California. It's important, that is something that has increased. It has not increased because violent arrest rate is going up. It's coming down. It's actually at the historic low. The reason for its share increasing is really that it's not coming down as quickly as that, those of felony property arrests and felony drug arrests. If we turn to the demographics and changes that we've seen there, let me start by talking a little bit of what that looks like. And although we have seen changes in these characteristics for the whole period that we're studying, we can say that those arrested tend to be non-white, younger, and male. And more specifically, if we look at it in 2016, we see that about 41% of all arrests were of Latinos, 36% were of whites, and 16% were of African Americans. And from that, what we see when we compare that to their share of the overall population in California, we see that African Americans are highly overrepresented in arrests. They only represent 6% of the population. Latinos were slightly overrepresented. They're about 39% of the population. Looking at age groups, really it's individuals between the ages of 18 to 39 that accounts for most arrests. They account for about 2/3 of the arrests, and it represents about 1/3 of the population in California. And lastly, and not surprisingly, men account for the majority of arrests. In 2016, about 3/4 of arrests were of males. So let's take a look at what we see in these longer-term trends. We do see decreases in racial disparity. What I'm showing you here are the arrest rates, the overall arrest rate for African Americans, for Latinos, and whites. And we see a significant decrease in the African American arrest rate. It's gone down from about 22,000 of 100,000 residents to about 10,000. So a drop of about 12,000 arrests per 100,000 residents. That's a very significant decrease, and it is much greater than the decrease we see among whites, where the arrest rate dropped by about 3,000. But in spite of this great significant decrease in the arrest rates of African Americans, we still see significant disparities. The African American arrest rate is 3 times greater than that of whites. We should also point out, there is another key thing here that is well worth pointing out, and that's when we look at the Latino arrest rate. In the late 1980s, the Latino arrest rate was about 1.8 times greater than that of whites. It's down to 1.1 times greater than that of whites. So we've seen improvement there in terms of disparity. The decreases in arrests are primarily of juveniles and young adults. And here, what I'm showing you are the arrest rate for various age groups in 1980 and 2016. And as you can see from here, the biggest decreases are among those two groups, juveniles and the youngest adults, those between the age of 18 and 24. The juvenile arrest rate dropped by about 84%. The arrest rate of those between the ages of 18 and 24 dropped by 63%. So those are big decreases in those groups. Turning to gender differences, what we see is that male arrest rates continue to be substantially higher than those of females, but that gap is also decreasing. We see that if we look in the 1980s, the male arrest rate was about 7 times greater than that of females. That's down to 3.3 times greater now among males compared to females. County differences. We see quite a bit of difference in terms of the arrest rates across counties. And what I'm showing you here are really the total arrest rates by California's 58 counties, broken down by felony and misdemeanors. And what you see here is that typically the higher arrest rates are in our smaller rural counties, and the lower arrest rates are generally in the larger urban counties. So looking then at what are those differences? What are the offenses and what are the differences in demographics that are driving these differences that we see across counties? And what we see is that if we take a look at first the felony arrests, it's really those differences across counties are driven by differences in drug and violent arrests. Whereas among misdemeanors, the differences in misdemeanors that we see, those are really driven by traffic and failure to appear in court or a warrant that's issued for misdemeanor arrests. And these are, the highest arrest rate for these type of offenses are those that we typically observe in the rural counties. On the topic of racial disparity, as I shared with you that we still have significant racial disparity. An obvious question is this something that is isolated to a few counties, or is this widespread in the state of California? When we look at this, we limit ourselves to counties that have at least 25,000 residents in them. So that leaves us with 49 counties. And what we see is that in 45 of those 49 counties, the African-American arrest rate is at least twice that of whites. And if we look at situations where the African-American arrest rate is at least 5 times that of whites, we find 13 of those counties. So this is something that's significant. It's widespread throughout California. When we look at the Latino arrest rate, we find that it's higher than the white arrest rate in a little bit less than half of those counties. So not quite as widespread, but it's not isolated to a few. But that disparity is much less than it is between African Americans and whites. We find 3 counties where the Latino arrest rate is at least twice that of whites. And lastly, the highest arrest rates of women tend to be in the rural counties. All right, so let me end here with kind of a quick conclusion and really a summary. What I think are the key findings of this report. There's been a lot of stats here, a lot to absorb. I think that despite that we see these significant decreases, the African American arrest rate is still 3 times greater than that of whites, and it is widespread throughout California, this disparity. Decreases in arrests are almost entirely due to the declines that we see in arrests of juveniles and young adults. And importantly, we see that women now account for about 1/4 of all arrests. That's up from 14% in 1980. So that's a significant increase. When we look at a recent criminal justice reform, Prop 47, we see that the decreases in the felony drug arrests after Prop 47, that was almost entirely offset by an increase in misdemeanor drug arrests. We do not see that same pattern for property offenses, which is also a type of crime that was affected by Prop 47. So that's a little bit surprising. And then also that there are notable differences between urban and rural counties. So what this report does, it shares with you, we give you a number of important changes and differences across counties, but arguably it raises more questions than it answers. Our next step here is try to understand what are the factors that are contributing to the changes that we see in California, and importantly, the differences that we see across the various jurisdictions as well. So we're going to look at factors such as demographics, crime rates, economic conditions, poverty, fiscal status, jail capacity, as well as law enforcement staffing, to see what kind of role they play in what we have been sharing with you here today and we're sharing with you in the report. we have introduced a number of significant criminal justice reforms in California, especially over the last 6, 7, 8 years. We're going to look at what kind of role do they play here in the trends that we see. And we're also going to look at, separate out differences. In this report and the work so far, we're simply sharing with you information on arrests. And arrests can lead to a citation and release or a booking into jail. We're going to look at those differential decisions as well to see what the data has to say about that. Lastly, before we move on to our panel here, I want to point out that the issue here of arrests and interaction between law enforcement and individuals, especially in this context of tension between law enforcement and some of the minority communities, is something that the legislature has recognized. And in 2015 passed the Racial and Identity Profiling Act that now mandates and will mandate, this will be rolled out over a number of years, collection of data on all initial police interactions. So there will be rich and very informative data on these kind of issues coming to us, but that data on a statewide level would not be available until 2023 at its earliest, and might very well be later than that. So we're hoping that in the meantime, the kind of information that we're releasing as part of this project will shed light on these issues, and that we can continue to give information about what is behind what we see here in arrests in California. And with that, I want to take this opportunity to invite Brandon Martin as the moderator, as well as our panelists to come up and discuss some of the findings here and some other issues.
Thank you, Magnus. As the panelists are getting settled, I'll give you a brief introduction of each of our panelists. I apologize. I worked a water station early Sunday morning for the International Marathon, and I got a little bit of a cold, so hopefully I don't sound too bad. So starting closest to me and moving forward, I know Marisa's not excited about sitting next to me with the cold, but I'll try not to get you sick. So starting directly next to me is Marisa Arrona. She is the Local Safety Solutions Project Director at Californians for Safety and Justice. She's been with CSJ for about the last 4 years, and before that she worked with the Vera Institute of Justice in New Orleans. In the middle is Gabe Caswell. He is currently counsel for the California State Senate Public Safety Committee. He's been there for a number of years, and before that he was also counsel with the Assembly Public Safety Committee. So in all, he has about 12 years working in the legislature with those committees on law enforcement issues. And then finally, down at the end of the table is Chief Daniel Hahn, who is currently the chief of the Sacramento Police Department since 2017. And before that, served 6 years as the chief at the Roseville Police Department. And I just want to once again thank the panelists for their time. Marisa and Chief Hahn are also on our advisory group, so they're doing double duty and being very generous with their time to both be at our advisory group meetings and here today. Okay, so as Magnus mentioned and Deborah mentioned to start off, we see reports of tensions between law enforcement and communities, and this project is in part motivated by bringing facts and information to a constructive conversation around those tensions and trust between law enforcement and communities. So I thought I would just start off with the million-dollar question, not start at a different point, but I wanted to give each of you a few minutes to give us what you believe are the priorities and issues that you believe need to be addressed and how we might start to address them to help the relationships between law enforcement and communities. I don't know if anyone is willing to go first. If not, we can start down at the end with Chief Hahn.
All right. I guess I'm willing to go first. So I think the question was, what are the priorities?
What do you see as the priorities or the issues that we need that we should be looking to address when it comes to relationships between law enforcement and communities?
Well, I don't just see it, it is our priority as the department I work for. I think it's naive if you don't think that if we did a survey, which we're doing actually, but if we did a survey for the entire Sacramento community, city of Sacramento community, and looked at like the level of trust that each neighborhood has in the police department, even though it's the same police department, it's the same city, it's within the same jurisdiction, served by the same officers and the same city departments, there would be a distinct difference in the level of trust depending on which neighborhood you're at. And I think as long as we have that, we have major issues. And there's tons of reasons why that trust level isn't where it is in other neighborhoods. But I think until we fix that, we're going to still grapple with this issue, this issue, the divide between law enforcement and the community that we've always dealt with in this country. There's never been a time in this country where certain segments of our community had a high level of trust as other neighborhoods do in their law enforcement agencies. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but that would be number one, trust.
I guess I would echo that in some ways, and I would say that probably the thing that I hear the most about in my job working for the legislature, coming from community groups, law enforcement agencies, et cetera, is trying to strike a balance in terms of how much transparency there is between law enforcement agencies and the public. There's interest on both sides. We want to protect we want to protect the officers and make sure that information isn't disclosed that's unfair or overly intrusive. But at the same time, we want to give the community enough information so that they know that the ship is being run properly and fairly and equitably. And so it's very difficult to thread that needle. And I think there were, a number of decades where there was no effort and no progress made in that area. But I think that everyone has started to come to the table with, legislation in and around body cameras or police disciplinary records and what could be released as opposed to absolutely nothing, and trying to strike a balance between what is private and what is public and what people should know. And if the community has at least some more access than they've been given historically, I think that will go a long way to rebuilding trust.
I definitely echo what both of you are saying here. And I work around the state with law enforcement and government on an initiative called Shared Safety. And Chief Hahn, Police Chief Eric Jones were just two of the law enforcement leaders that helped inform and guide the development of that shared safety framework. And I would say a focus on really investing public resources on prevention and protection of our vulnerable populations over policing. And I mean policing as a sort of a back-end reactionary sort of solution, if you will, to harm or when it's caused. And I think our traditional systems have been built up a certain way. Chief alludes to this. There are some deep-seated structural racist elements of the traditional criminal justice system. So I think efforts to start unpacking that, also trying to address the couple of decades where attention wasn't focused in certain areas. This is a long road ahead of us. I'm very thankful PPIC is kicking off this conversation or sort of enriching the conversation with data, but I would say priorities to prevention and protection of vulnerable populations over policing and really focusing on identifying vulnerable populations. I think that we try and use traditional measures like crime rates and arrest rates to measure the success of reforms or changes. And we really need to ask, what should we be measuring? What are the different things that we should be measuring? And there are knowable things out in the universe, like identifying vulnerable populations and harm indicators that we can start focusing on.
Great, thank you. Gabe, I'd like to go back to you. I was hoping you could give us a little bit more. Magnus mentioned the Racial and Identity Profiling Act of 2015 as being one of the legislative policies that have come out in the last few years about addressing interactions between the law enforcement and communities. And I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more background on how Ripa came about and sort of the intent of the legislature, and then also if you'd like to spend a few minutes detailing other initiatives that have come out of the legislature, that'd be great.
It came from a Shirley Weber Assembly bill, and the intent of the legislation, I think it's almost obvious, is to basically at least start to collect data in terms of who's being stopped, who's being arrested, whether or not the purpose for the stops, the lengths of the stops. One of the more difficult parts of that legislation was they wanted information on a person's, let's say, their sexual preference, or their gender identity was another thing. And so, but it also, they didn't want the officer to ask, are you a man or are you a woman, or go into those types of questions. So it's perceived identity. But those were some of the more difficult parts of that legislation to get passed. But as we stand today, there is now a Ripa board, and the Ripa board has promulgated regulations over the past year. They released a fairly lengthy initial report detailing how they're going to roll out what data they're going to present. The first actual report with some data in it is going to come from the 9 largest law enforcement agencies in the state, and that report is scheduled to be released in January of 2020. They started collecting data in July of 2018, and the first report will contain data up until April of 2019, and that'll be transferred to the DOJ, and there will be an initial report released. But we won't get statewide data for a few years.
And Chief Hahn, is your agency starting January 1? I don't remember.
Yes.
Yes. And so could you just give us a sense of sort of how that implementation is going with Ripa, and how you're preparing your officers for those data collection requirements?
Yeah, actually, I just came from a meeting about Ripa before this meeting. So we've been collecting data for years, over a decade, but definitely not as robust amount of data as the Ripa program requires. So we're talking about that today. So there'll be mandatory training for all officers, and then mandatory that they fill it out whenever they do any kind of stops.
Great, thank you. Gabe, was there any other recent measures that you wanted to talk about?
I would also add that was one of the concerns I didn't mention, but when the bill was passed, that was some of the concerns of law enforcement, is the increased workload, but that's kind of obvious. In terms of, additional legislation, I mean, we've got, I really don't know what's coming up this year. We have a new governor, and so it's kind of hard to predict what people are going to legislate in this area. We kind of got a lot accomplished with the last governor. We moved the ball on a lot of issues. Like I spoke about transparency. Last year, Senator Skinner carried a bill to bring some transparency to police disciplinary practices in very limited areas, specifically sexual assault, use of force, and dishonesty, specifically dishonesty in and around doing their job, not putting false information on when you got to work or not, but if you're falsifying a police report.
That'd be a problem too.
But so it was very limited. We worked very closely with the police chiefs. Police chiefs actually came on board on that bill and were supportive. And so now there are, obviously going to be issues with implementing that, and resources will have to be dedicated. But that was a fairly major accomplishment, because the sides had been at loggerheads for so long on that issue that nothing had been accomplished. And so I think in terms of next steps, it'll be very interesting to see what the Ripa reports say, and what legislative action may or may not need to be taken as it relates to that. I think a slightly small step that was taken in the previous year, Cork Silva had a bill, I believe it was AB 572. She increased the refresher training that officers have to go through in order on issues of profiling. It had been once every 5 years. She has increased that to yearly, so it's now annual. So I'd say, but in terms of what's going to happen, I really don't know. They just started introducing bills yesterday. So
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no worries. Thank you for that. Marisa, I'd like to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about the blueprint for shared safety and exactly how the point of arrest fits into that. And if you have any examples of agencies you've been working with to sort of give us a sense of how this blueprint rolls out. You mentioned that it goes beyond just crime rates and arrest rates of a way to think about things. So what other factors go into that blueprint, basically?
Thank you. So we launched the Blueprint for Shared Safety March of 2017, and I mentioned Chief Hahn, Chief Jones. We had a really long list of thought partners that went into developing the blueprint, law enforcement, but also public health experts, behavioral health community advocates. And really, I can sum up the shared safety framework in one sentence that seems to impact a lot of system leaders that we speak with. So we call it shared safety. We didn't call it community safety or public safety for obvious reasons. Those words sort of trigger reactions in people. If you say public safety, community might think, oh, that's about policing. If you say community safety, law enforcement might think, oh, maybe that's not a space where they might want my input. So we really were intentional about calling it shared safety because shared safety is more than the absence of crime. It's got to be the presence of well-being. And I think when we start asking these questions about what else are we measuring, are we only measuring the safety of our community by crime rates? Like what do they really tell you? If half of crime is not even reported, what does the arrest rate tell you, right? Do you know what survivors need for healing? Do you know what victim services are available? Do you know what barriers exist to victims getting services? If it's, only through the district attorney's office or no community-based organization, there's really a series of questions that jurisdictions and community groups should be asking their electeds. Are there crisis response centers? Are there community-based, school-based trauma recovery centers? Is there a waiting list at the domestic violence shelter? If there's an increase in young people in multiple public systems, foster system, homeless youth, are we asking why? In one jurisdiction, it was the opioid crisis. Parents were either ending up incarcerated or very tragically dying, and there were youth being left without a safety family net. So there are 5 principles to the shared safety framework. At our core, we put survivors at the center of a safety conversation. Again, when you put survivors at the center of a safety conversation, you start asking different questions, such as, what do you need to heal? What would help you through this trauma? We use a public health lens to have a safety discussion, and when you use a public health lens, you define safety differently, and you define it as well-being. And I think at the advisory group, Deborah said that we all did find common ground. We all want safer communities, right? There's shared values that we're all working on. I would add, I think we also do want healthy communities where you nurture, kids have parks and are safe to run around. And crime survivors at the center, public health lens, you define well-being as safety. You use a different risk, harm, need analysis to assess not just risk, but needs to prevent the harm from occurring again. And you build community and police trust to make this entire system work. Again, long road ahead of us. We have incredible partners in Stockton. We've been talking to Chief Hahn and Captain here, Santa Cruz, Los Angeles, and Oakland. And we're actually bringing together system leaders from those 5 cities, as well as examples from New York and some other cities across the country to begin a peer exchange and rolling this out across the state. So sharedsafety.us if you want to check out the website.
Great. Thank you, Marisa. I'd like to go back to you, Chief Hahn, and actually sort of take a step back. We've been talking about larger issues and about policies, but I'd like to I don't know if the general reader of our reports or the general citizen has a sense of what goes into sort of arrest decisions. How does it vary between a misdemeanor and a felony? Sort of what's the on the ground process of an arrest from an officer's perspective, and sort of how that works. I mean, we know that not every arrest leads to a booking to jail, and how does that occur in your jurisdiction?
Yeah, sure. I think most people don't understand completely what all arrests are. So arrests could be what most people think of as an officer handcuffing somebody and taking them down to the jail, and they're booked. They could stay there anywhere from 4 hours to years now. And the 4-hour ones would be about the time it takes to process somebody through for the sheriff deputies to fingerprint them, photograph them. But an arrest is also, if one of the typical ones, especially when I was a young officer, would be shoplifting at Safeway. Say the security there catches you, they call the police department, we give you a citation, a misdemeanor citation. That's technically an arrest also, even though you never go to jail or anything like that. So anything from a misdemeanor citation to arrest, taking somebody to jail, those are all technically arrests.
Are there any examples? I want to get into a discussion about diversion programs and give you guys the chance to all talk. But Chief Hahn, do you have arrest diversion programs here in Sacramento, or how do those programs work if you do?
Yes, there's multiple. There's mental health court. There's diversion for young kids. There's been programs that have come and gone, whether they're peer court. Some kids back in the day, if they got arrested, typically it's for like vandalism, things, low-level things like that. They could go to peer court, and peer court is where other high school students would be the district attorney role. Some high school students would be the public defender role, and then some would be the jury. And then typically the penalties were, and it was done in front of a real judge in a real courtroom out there off of Howe Avenue, and the penalties usually were community service, things like that. So there's been numerous programs over the years that are things like that. But like as one example, sex trafficking is obviously a huge issue. And one of the more challenging in the current climate is what to do with the girls that are involved in the sex trafficking. Technically, laws changed recently, but for the longest time, technically it's a crime what the girls are doing, but we don't want to treat them like suspects because oftentimes they're 10, 12 years old. And so, but what do you do with them? If you just let them go, oftentimes in our line of work, one of the reasons why they're out there is their home life is so bad that at least initially this was better than their home life. You don't really want to take them home like you would other juvenile, kids shoplifting at the store, you typically take them home. So you don't want to take them home, but there's not a ton of services. So oftentimes the best route for some time was to take them to juvenile hall to try to get them that break between the pimp and them. And so I think we're getting better and better at, we hired a social worker in the police department. We're in the process of hiring a social worker, actually, it's been approved. And in addition to mental health team and dealing with mental health issues in our community, that's another thing, because we do have some nonprofits like CASH and City of Refuge and other organizations that deal with young girls and adult girls that are in that. So, I mean, that'd be another area. There's a lot of areas that need more work on because you don't necessarily want to put them into the criminal justice system, one, because of the record, but probably more importantly, that's probably not the best way to solve the underlying issue so they don't continue that behavior or destructive behavior to themselves.
Gabe, I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about diversion programs, whether it's, I know a few years ago, I think there was some money in the budget for a LEAD program that the BSUC ran, and then also we have some funding now coming from Prop 47 that has been going to some of those diversion programs.
Yeah, and I would say we have a number of diversion programs that come up that are based on local jurisdictions that someone wants to take statewide. And they can be targeted in particular groups, such as veterans. That's one that we very commonly get. Prostitution, we get it both in terms of the women who, or I shouldn't specify, but the prostitutes themselves, or what are proverbially known as Johns, are the people who are the purchasers. We've found, and local jurisdictions have found, that, for instance, there's something called John School, and they teach these people who are the purchasers of
People.
Sexual, exactly. They teach them that they are actually exploiting. They're exploiting these women, and they don't. Maybe they don't understand the gravity of what they're doing, and that actually the success rates of these programs and the recidivism rates for these people who go through these schools it's actually very low. They do not offend again. It's a very high success rate. There's a lot of growing pains on this stuff. I think what Chief Hahn was just talking about is an excellent example. When it comes to sexually exploited minors, these children were typically arrested, charged with a crime, or housed as a criminal and put through the juvenile justice system. And we struggled with how to do that. The initial approaches, probably around 2008 or so, were to legalize prostitution for minors, essentially. Say it's not a crime because these are children. They cannot even consent to sex. So, but what are we going to do with them? The initial approach was to put them in juvenile hall, but they're not charged with the crime. So if they were loitering outside of a 7-Eleven and they were picked up for prostitution, they can never go in front of a judge. So you're left with a Guantanamo Bay type of a situation. So that wasn't a workable scenario. And it wasn't until State Senator Holly Mitchell came up with the idea of using the existing juvenile dependency processes that we have already to get these children who are in dysfunctional situations, services. That was the right way to go, and that was the way we did it. So, we struggle with things in the legislature all the time, and specifically with diversion, there's always a debate about deferred entry of judgment versus diversion. The basics is deferred entry of judgment, person pleads guilty, that guilty verdict is hanging over their head, and if they mess up, then they can be sentenced for the crime. And whereas opposed to a diversion program, you never actually enter a guilty plea. And there's a number of impacts to actually entering a guilty plea. Probably the most significant one in California is immigration consequences. If you enter a guilty plea on a number of crimes, you are subject to deportation. And so for a number of years, there was a push to go with the DOJ model because it was easier on the court system to just have that guilty verdict or a guilty plea hanging over the person's head. But I think with some of the more recent, there's been a more progressive movement in California in terms of treating immigrants in an equitable way. And so I feel like the pendulum is sort of moving back to diversion programs in California.
Okay. Marisa, so with your blueprints, what's I'm sure the balance at the local level with resources between prevention and diversion, how does that sort of work out in that blueprint and your work with them?
Yeah, so a couple of, thank you for Chief and Gabe. You made me sort of think about trying to sum all of this up. I think that two really important things come up. Ideally, in the shared safety framework, a local jurisdiction would address the harm that's occurring, the thing that's happening, before a point of arrest even occurs. That's ideal, right? Ideally, corrections spending would be diverted to prevention spending, and we'd find a balance there. I've seen that the most successful diversion programs are those that are collaborative. So a law enforcement assisted diversion program where behavioral health, mental health, addiction specialists, everyone sort of works together. A harm reduction model, forget somewhere on the East Coast, if there's a police contact with an individual who's using, they are driven to, or an angel volunteer is called, to take that individual, if they agree, to treatment. So I will start by saying that really the goal of shared safety is to work with government and law enforcement to really go way upstream and look at prevention ideas. Ideally, we would narrow the pipeline into prison and into jail because we're addressing all of the drivers of crime way upstream. Many of the drivers of crime are poverty, homelessness, addiction, youth who are kicked out of the home for various reasons, or LGBTQIA population, just vulnerable populations, right? And when the only response, I mean, it's tragic that for sexually exploited children, the system had to sort of make do with the juvenile system is all we have. And really the shared safety framework asks, well, what should we have instead? And what should we be measuring instead? And so that's sort of our take on diversion programs.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you for that. I want to get to audience Q&A to make sure there's time for that. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands. We have microphones that we will bring around. That way the people watching online can hear. And we just ask that the more questions we can get through, the better. So please have your question ready to go.
Jeff Tartagia, an advocate. Question is dealing with rearrest, because I've been in the process for the last 5 years looking at recidivism, and it seems like our prison population has not changed, yet probation loads have more than doubled. So I just bring up, the proverbial statement for 50 years has been, once you're in the system, you're stuck in the system. Rearrest.
Well, I'll start with the last part. Probation loads, I would guess one of the reasons why they've increased is because basically the state has taken what used to be under the parole departments and put them under the probation department. So they have a whole new population that they never had before. So I would guess that's at least part of the reasons why their numbers are up. I would say I've heard our probation chief in Sacramento County say that juvenile hall is, wouldn't say empty, but a lot less full than it used to be. So at least the in custody part is less. Why the reasons for that, I don't know. He would know, I would assume, but I don't. So, yeah.
And I think to piggyback on that, I think a lot of, I noticed in your data that, and your report, that juvenile arrests have basically gone away. I mean, compared to what they were. I mean, they're not non-existent, but they're very low. I think that one of the reasons for that, and I don't know this, but I think this is quite possible, is because for a number of years now, probably decades, like a couple of decades, I'm not exactly sure when it started, we started shifting juveniles from state incarceration to local incarceration. And by doing that, we're leaving them closer to their families, we're leaving them in their communities, we're relying on local jurisdictions to deal with their own problems. And by doing that, I would suspect the recidivism rate has gone down. Rather than shipping these children off to a warehouse on the state level, keeping them in their own communities, I think, is probably the better way of dealing with it. And having their local probation officers, reintroduce them in the community, I think that most likely, just common sense, is going to result in a lower rate of recidivism. And so I think that might have a lot to do with the lower arrest rates for juveniles.
I'll add one more thing, and I don't know if Magnus is still here, but I imagine he would at least echo the first part, what I'm going to say. You have to be very careful about numbers and what are within those numbers. And I'll just give one example. AB 109 passed. And one of the things, I don't know if it was an official way whoever's counting is counting, but one of the ways that you'd often hear of a measurement of success was recidivism rate. So recidivism rate in California, I think, was the highest in the entire country for years and years, as long as I can remember, at least one of the highest, 70-some%. But I would tell you that's a very flawed way of determining whether AB 109 is successful, because I could change the recidivism rate without AB 109 easily. I could just say you don't violate people's parole anymore. And so a violation of parole would mean all of you in here, unless you're on the old school parole, can associate with gang members, can go to any place you want. But if you're on parole, you might have a condition that says you can't associate with a gang member, you can't drink, you can't, any number of things. Go to a certain area of town if that's where your issues were at. Whereas if you were not on parole, you could do all those things. So you would get arrested for those things that everybody else could do. There was quite a number of those arrests. If tomorrow you said no longer do that, you'd drop your recidivism rate drastically. But you really haven't changed anything other than just the way you do things. So to me, anything we do, at least two significant things of measurement should be, one, crime. How much crime is in our community? Because that so much impacts people's lives. And then quality of life. What's the quality of life in Del Paso Heights versus Fab 40s? And those, to me, if you're trying to reduce recidivism, the reason you're trying to reduce it is because you want to reduce crime and harm in people's lives and the quality of life. So measure that. Don't just change one rule and then, because it doesn't really change life in the community, it just changes your numbers. So you got to be very careful of what's behind the numbers when we count numbers and make sure it's actually meaningful to the community.
Brendan, can I add something Chief made me think of, and especially as you guys prepare for the sort of the next stage of the research, it's great that you'll be looking at economic conditions and sort of the conditions of the environment in which people live, in which they might get arrested. What's interesting about the recidivism arrest, especially when I think you'll be measuring or looking at the impacts of criminal justice reforms maybe in the next stage. So critics of criminal justice reforms will often cite rearrest rates, right? So Prop 47 is a failure because person Y is still getting arrested 600 times or 47 times. And often law enforcement agencies will have a list of the top 200 individuals and the number of times they've been arrested. So a response to that could also be, well, clearly arrest doesn't work. Why do we keep arresting this individual? By your own admission, you have to keep arresting them. You know this person by name. What should we be doing differently? And things to measure environmental conditions. It's also, it would be interesting to know how many individuals with a felony conviction in this community have access to a job. Or have overcome structural barriers and are addressing the collateral consequences of their felony conviction. That may or may not, and it's likely to impact a recidivism rate. So these are all just, to Chief's point, you just need to measure a lot of better data points that'll tell the fuller picture about why someone is recidivating, rather than saying our recidivism rate has been at or near 70 for many years. And in any business model, investors would withdraw their money from a failed company that's at 70% failure. And so why do our taxpayer funds keep going into correction spending when we don't do anything differently and we're not helping? In fact, we're probably harming a lot of the people caught up in the justice system.
Any other questions?
This one's going back to Brandon's first question, and in regards to some of the issues that needed to be addressed. The panel had mentioned trust, transparency, reactionary policing, and for those latter two, it's kind of easy to visualize what legislation may look like to address those two, but in terms of improving trust, and this is really a question for members of the advisory group. Sorry, Gabe. What are some of those recommendations or discussions had by members of the group towards improving trust? And is legislation the best method of doing so, or what are some of those alternative mediums looked at to try to improve trust?
I'll go first. I'll start a little bit, just add to my bio a little bit. I think I have, in some ways, we all have our own stories and all our own experiences, and we're only a product of our experiences. But I was given up for adoption at birth and adopted at 3 months old. My dad died when I was 5, so I was basically raised by a single mom. I had a brother, and my older sister was born with hydrocephalus, so she has mental and physical disabilities to this day. I witnessed a shooting homicide in front of I was one of only 2 witnesses to a shooting homicide in front of my house when I was 10 years old, had to testify in Superior Court when I was 12 years old. I got arrested for assault on an officer when I was 16 years old and taken to juvenile hall. My younger brother, 2 years younger than me, was murdered in downtown when I was working, I identified them in my beat. And I grew up on the corner of 33rd and 2nd Avenue in Oak Park, which when I grew up, it was one of the main sex trafficking strolls in Sacramento, along with Stockton Boulevard, and drug trafficking on my corner every day. And then now I've been a police officer for 31 years. And so I would say one of the things to improve trust that we have to do is probably, to a certain extent, change what we've been doing. And I don't mean as a police department, I mean as an entire society and a community. Because too often, in my opinion, we look for the simple solution. And simple either means I just need to find some money, change a rule, and pay for it, or just change a rule, enact an ordinance, or legislation, and then just move forward. But I'll just give you one example. One of the biggest, and we've even talked about it here, one of the biggest things that we've done in this realm especially over the last couple of years, is body cameras or cameras in general, whatever. Dash cameras, body cameras, helicopter cameras, whatever cameras you can figure out to strap on somebody. And I would just ask you, how successful has that been? I mean, I am all for cameras. You will never find the Sacramento Police Department without body cameras, and probably some whatever new kind of camera can come out. We're working on new places to put them and new ways so they'll capture more of what we as a society are trying to capture. But the question is, if it comes to trust, especially in the segments of our community that have the highest level of distrust, we've had body cameras now almost a year in Sacramento, and we've had dash cameras, in-car cameras, for probably 10 years. And I would say the level of trust in the segments of our community that have a high level of distrust is no different now than it was a year ago. Now, granted, it's only been a year, so maybe it will improve over time. But I would venture to tell you, body cameras are easy in the grand scheme of things. All you have to do is find enough money and then mandate that every officer carries one on their chest and they must have it on and blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't get to the heart of the issue. So in best case scenario for a camera, in a bad situation, best case scenario is you catch an officer doing something that is not what you want them to do in your society. And the reason you were able to catch him is because he had a camera on him and you caught that on camera. I would tell you, if that's our goal, shame on us. Because our goal should be preventing that officer from doing something bad in the first place. It's all reactive. So it's not that it's not needed. The bad part is when we say that's the solution, like 100%. That's the solution. That it plays a role. I think it does help over time with transparency, but it doesn't get to the heart of people feel that when I'm a certain race, or I'm a certain gender, or I'm a certain lifestyle, or in a certain neighborhood, I'm treated differently than somebody else. Well, ask yourself, well, if that officer has a camera on, are you going to feel different? I venture to say the answer is no. I still feel that way. So we have to get to the point where we have to expand people's experiences. We got to change the way we hire, change the way we train, include the community in the police department and the police department in the community, and change, because when people say we got to get bias out of the police department, I say shame on you again. It's impossible. You can't. If we're asking ourselves if there's biases in law enforcement, that's a stupid question in my opinion. Of course there are. There's biases in every facet of our society. There's no exceptions, none. So how we think you can go to a 6-month academy and not have bias anymore, you're naive. So to me, the question should be, if to the extent possible, what are those biases? And more importantly, how do those impact how we deliver service, interact, and partner with our community? And then the last most important question, what do you do about it? Not if we have it. Of course we have it. I have biases, you have biases, we all have biases. And so I think our biggest problem to the trust question is we look for the simple solutions and we don't partner real well to each other. And part of that partnering is being completely honest with each other, which means we got to take some responsibility for some things. And so we move forward with the easy things and we end up with body cameras as our solutions. Things calm down a little bit. And then 5 years later, some major event happens again, and we wonder why we're in the same spot. We've been doing that for hundreds of years, literally over and over. I mean, I was a patrol officer when Rodney King happened. Felt very similar to where we're at now. Nothing's changed. It's gotten worse. So that's what I would say.
Could I add?
Sorry, that was a speech. Sorry.
No, wow, Chief, that's important words. I mean, in a nutshell, systemic change. There are two just very quick examples, echo everything that Chief just said. It's difficult to legislate humanity and us caring about each other, right? And people, when you say that, there's someone watching going, oh God, rolling their eyes. But that's really what it's going to take. There are innovative leaders in law enforcement. It's also sort of, it's not all police and community, it's systems and community. We don't trust the mental and behavioral health clinic when we show up. They'll spend 2 hours doing an intake with you, only to tell you, well, you don't qualify here, but I don't know where you do qualify, so you're going to have to go to the next system, the next bureaucratic office. And if I'm homeless or I have a behavioral health issue, I'm not likely to go to the next appointment. An easy fix there is that the person who does that intake might know that you don't qualify for that agency, but they do know who you do qualify for. And that starts to rebuild just sort of trust in the system. As between law enforcement and community, there have literally been living room dialogues with law enforcement. In Stockton, Chief Jones did it. And credits it to really starting to rebuild a lot of community trust that was harmed and eroded during a tough on crime era. And sort of acknowledging that over-policing not only has not made us safer, but in fact has harmed a lot of communities and eroded a lot of that trust. So it takes, really wisdom by Chief Hahn at recognizing the systemic changes that need to be made, and also recognizing like we need to go living room to living room and rebuilding that trust. And that is what it will take. And there are people doing that across the state, thankfully.
I'll give you a legislative example, though. So one of the solutions people talk about, and I think that's a flawed solution, not a complete solution either, is diversifying law enforcement. So it looks more like the community. I think that's a great goal. I'm totally against diversification for diversity's sake. I want to make it to where a diverse pool of people are capable, qualified, and then you'll get it naturally. But so for a couple of academies a few years ago, we kicked out about 16, somewhere around there, people out of the academy. So not the ones that quit, not the ones that, just came in a week later, this is not for me, but kicked out. Like they flunked too many tests or whatever, and they kicked them out. 100% of the people that were kicked out were what you could call diverse, either racially or gender-wise. In other words, there's no white males kicked out. Let's just make it simple. And so if you're talking about you want to diversify the police department, well, the vast majority of your diversity in your academy, your hiring pool, you just kicked out of the academy 2 academies in a row, and I'm sure long before that, I didn't go back farther than that. Well, one of the rules of post that governs all law enforcement is that you train somebody and say, and all those people were kicked out for driving or shooting. 2 topics I think that pretty much anybody can learn giving amount of time. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to hit the target and to drive a car. But it is, like when I went to the academy, I'd never touched a gun before in my life. My roommate was 53 and he just finished 30 years in the military. Who do you think shot faster? Who do you think picked it up quicker? I didn't even know how to take the gun apart. Like, I didn't know anything about a gun. And so, but post rule is you train, you test, and if you don't pass the test, in other words, like for range, you don't hit the target enough times, you get 1 remediation. That's it. And if you don't pass that remediation, you're gone. So now I happen to pass, barely. I'm still not a great shot, so if anybody wants somebody to shoot at him, I'm probably the one to do it because I'll miss you 90% of the time. I did qualify last night, though, so I'm good. But the point being is to think that my roommate, Jim, and I are going to pick this range training up at the same speed when he has so much more experience. I mean, I don't think we do education like that now, but that's still the rule. And so this person that, might have missed it by 1 round on the target, if we had given them 2 more weeks of training, they probably would have passed it. Now, granted, I don't want them to graduate the academy not being able to hit the target. At some point, they're going to have to pass the test. I'm just not sure why do we have this like one-time thing. And so we're solving it internally. I testified in front of the Post Commission about that, so they are looking at that and a few other things that are similar to that. But those are like legislative fixes. It won't completely change everything, but every little thing counts. Now we do a pre-academy that's heavy on range and heavy on driving, so before they even get to the academy, they already have a certain level of experience. And until last week, it was working perfectly, and then last week we kicked 2 people out for driving. But it has worked really well. There's just 2 people, whereas before it was 16. So it's things like that, you know, what might have worked before doesn't mean it works now. And, you know, before, I mean, I've worked with like a lieutenant one time who's from Detroit, and his dad was from Detroit, and they worked for like Ford or something, some factory in Detroit. And they would tell you, not horrific, but horrible stories about the way they were treated. And they hated their boss, and they hated Ford. But to this day, they won't buy anything but a Ford. Like, and they never left Ford. Like, I'll come to work grumbling every day, but I'm so dedicated to Ford, right? Even though our generations don't do that now. If our generations now don't like you, they're gone. It's not unusual to have somebody have 5 different, 10 different companies that they work for. That's not the way it used to be. So now, if you go to the academy and you get kicked out like the 5th month into the 6-month academy because you didn't pass your last range test, if you're a great employee, we keep you employed around the station, and then the next academy 2 months later starts, we put you in that. But what's to say you just go, I guess this isn't for me. I'll go be a banker. The generations have changed, and we have to change with it. So that would be an example of a legislative fix.
I have great respect for all of you, but I must say, I'm a peer sports specialist, I'm a social worker, and I'm a teacher, a credentialed teacher, and I am horrified. I've also had decades of experience working with offenders and families. I will be brief. I absolutely, strenuously object to the idea that taking a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old who's been trafficked and not returning them to their families because you're stereotyping, stigmatizing the child and the family is what's going on. And they don't need to be in juvenile hall. They are missing out on their peers at school. They're missing out on their faith community. They're missing out on sports activities, various other things. They don't need to be jailed. They're the victim. And I won't take any more time, but there are a lot of issues that you bring up. And I hope that members of the public can reach out and give impact to some of your statements, because there's a different issue with healing families. I'm also a NAMI member. Families can be healed, but putting the child in juvenile hall is horrifying.
I don't know if you misunderstood me, but I completely agree with you.
And I would say that has definitely not been the goal of any legislation that's been passed since I've worked at the state capitol. I would say, and since before me, I would say the goals have been to not put children in cages, or in, they're not really cages anymore, but to not put them in juvenile hall, and to reunify families. I think the earlier example that we talked about with sexually exploited minors is a good one. That's why we didn't pass the law in 2008, because it would have taken children and put them in juvenile hall, even though they weren't charged with crimes, because an officer or someone encountered them and thought that they were prostituting themselves. We didn't pass that law. We didn't think it was well enough cooked. The version we passed does put them through the juvenile dependency system, but that doesn't mean putting them in juvenile hall. That means returning them to their families if their families are safe, if their families aren't the ones pimping them out. That's the goal, and that's why we went that route instead. And so I don't know what the future is going to hold. I don't know who's going to be elected next time. But I would say for now, that's definitely not the goal of the California State Legislature to pass laws or to further policies that would do that.
And you raise, thank you, if I could, you raise a related, really important point. Shared safety would also say that for survivors of trafficking, really survivors of many different kinds of crimes and violence and trauma, it's critical to hear from them, obviously at a point where they have been, as a part of their healing process, if that's okay, to the extent that they can participate, they should be informing these policy decisions, and there should be survivors at every table, at every legislative table. When the question is asked, yeah, we all agree juvenile hall would be a horrible place for a sexually exploited minor. So what should we be doing? And should it be juvenile dependency court? If not, what else would it be? And to have survivors at the table really integrated into that discussion.
Thank you for the question. We have time for one or two more questions.
So I'm actually a crime survivor, and I also am an attorney who advocates for immigrant crime survivors, and has done that for a couple of decades now. I echo what you're saying about there's, just like there's systemic prejudices that are reflected in the criminal justice system, they are also reflective of systemic prejudices and judgments against survivors, as, and so I'll just try to give an example of, like a survivor of intimate partner violence, for example, will be judged for having, kind of a broken compass on choosing their partner, and will be given, instead of when they go in to ask for services, will be kind of lectured about, what they should do in their dating life, instead of kind of like the, compassionate approach. And then I wanted to actually talk a little bit about how it's been the flip side of the data. I represent a lot of survivors of human trafficking, including both labor and sex trafficking. And, Chief Hahn mentioned
Daniel's
Daniel Hahn.
Daniel's fine.
Mentioned the shift that Sacramento as a jurisdiction has been making from criminalization to, remediation of child sex trafficking. And I wanted to just give an anecdote of one family that I've worked with to show how incredibly transformative that critical point can be in a family's life. I work with a Mexican farm worker family, and one of their daughters was trafficked when underage, was arrested, and had to get a public defender. And they're still traumatized years later. It's resulted in addiction by other family members and re-arrests of other family members. And now their immigration status is now going to be in jeopardy. And it all stemmed from, in my opinion, maybe they would differ, but as an observer, having worked with them, I think that initial incarceration of her as a 16 or 17-year-old really, really deeply traumatized that family. They had done everything they could to make everything work for their family. And here she was in juvenile hall because of a boyfriend, situation gone wrong. And so I actually understand that, family members in that circumstance would have started drinking, because it's just an awful situation to be in. And so I just wanted to say there's a complexity to this, and that's on the other side of the data, that real people are being impacted. And then they may come into a public health office, and which has actually happened to these clients, and they'll say, you're an alcoholic. You need to get, the alcoholism resolved, and how dare you have an alcohol problem? And it's like, well, there's these systemic biases that are affecting them. So, so I would echo kind of what's been said. I also want to say something I've observed in decades working here in Sacramento is that you have to be careful about who holds themselves out to be a protector of vulnerable populations. Because I have seen many times people who say, oh, I want to help trafficking survivors, basically pimp them out again. So I am very careful when I work with trafficking survivors about what is the ethics of the of the organizations. And so I really appreciate that shared safety network, because everybody's going to be at the table in something like that. Thank you.
Great points.
One final question.
I can be loud. I'm Susan Olson. I work at the California Department of Education. And I am thinking of the training and education of the police force, in a very similar way as we train and teach teachers. And, you talked a little bit about, we can't remove bias. But I'm curious to know, are there things being done, changes being made in the academies to at least screen for it, and also changing some of the education practices to really deal with some of the really blatant bias, to try to improve, who we put out in the community to work in the same way that we try to address those same issues in education.
Yeah, there's tons, so I probably can't go over all of them. But I would say not only police officers, but as an entire community, we have to do that because there's biases going in every direction. But specific to the police department, we've always screened for it. They go through an extensive background. If we found out somebody was, a racist, for example, they wouldn't get hired. But the implicit bias is much harder. So we have training classes, but I think training is important, but just a training class by itself that you get once every year, once every 5 years, I mean, that doesn't do a whole lot. So we're working right now with John Powell from UC Berkeley and ALF to develop, to look at our training for implicit bias specifically, but more importantly, an ongoing program that is a check to that. So the other things are, I just think a lot of that is a lack of experience. So, I mean, just as an example, it wouldn't be unusual for you to grow up in, say, Granite Bay, be a young, white guy growing up, parents, mom's a doctor, dad's a lawyer, whatever. I think sometimes we blame you as a person for having that background, and I think that's silly. Like, there's a lot of people that would love to grow up in Granite Bay and have the means and go on vacations and do all those sort of things. So I don't think we should blame the person for their lack of experiences. But what is not unusual to happen is, so you go to Granite Bay High School, the chances of you hanging out in other neighborhoods is slim and none. I mean, I grew up in Oak Park, and if I had a friend that pulled up in front of my house and said, jump in the ride, we're going to go play hoop in the Heights, I would have looked at them like they're crazy. Like, no, we don't go to the Heights. We're Oak Park. We don't go up there. And you ask somebody in the Heights, they say the exact same thing. We don't go to Oak Park. You stay in your neighborhood. So I'm imagining if you grew up in Granite Bay, you're not hanging out in the Heights on the weekends, right? And if you told your parents that, they'd probably, oh, no. So, but you do, so you don't have any experience at all with neighborhoods like the Heights. Direct experience. But you do have experience because you watch it on the news just about every night. You watch the shooting that supposedly happened at the football game like 10 years ago that didn't actually happen at the football game, but that's the way it's reported still to this day, and showing videos of football players hitting the ground while gunshots are ringing out. So you have an experience, you have an impression what that neighborhood's like. So then you graduate from high school, you go to Sac State, and maybe your junior or senior year, you graduate, you become a police officer, and we put you on swing shift in Del Paso Heights. Right. Now, that doesn't mean there's going to be a problem, but it means there's probably a little bit higher likelihood to be a misunderstanding because you have no understanding of the norms, the culture, the desires, the wants, the those sort of things. And so we're doing a lot of like in speaking of sex trafficking, we bring people that were in sex trafficking into the academy to talk to the recruits now about their life, because I want to humanize it, because we have a tendency to, not just cops, but people in general, dehumanize that we don't understand or is not common in society. So we dehumanize that person that's in sex trafficking, and then it's okay to take them to juvenile hall or not give a concern about this person. I'm just doing my job, put the handcuffs on, take you over there. But if they're humanized, then now I'm going to be searching high and low for how can I help you. And so we do that. We have a lot of what we do now is to expand experiences. So we do a day of service where last academy, we did it in Del Paso Heights. We go to the community leaders and say, there's 32 graduates. from the academy last month, we're going to do a day of service in your community. What do you want us to do? But it has to be you and the community together, meaning that recruit has to work side by side at whatever you're going to do with a community leader. So it's not just cleaning up the neighborhood if that's what they choose, but it's cleaning up the neighborhood with a community person from that neighborhood where you're going to, at some point, have to talk. And then at lunch, we eat lunch, everyone is each lunch together. And then the Heights decide the second half of the day would be break out into these circles where you have half community people, half officer, these brand new recruits, and just talk and the conversations. And then we do a walk in our shoes program for those same people like the following month. Then they shadow a community leader in a neighborhood that they're not from for a day. And then that community leader goes on a ride along with them the next month. So they learn about what that officer is facing, and then the third month they come back together. And I'm sure we'll come up with more, but I mean, it's all in an effort to expand the experiences, so we're better equipping our people to work in the neighborhoods we're telling them they have to work in. Otherwise, there's, I mean, and I don't think it's that employee's fault. Right. I think it's us as an organization and us as a community's fault to see that and think, oh, okay, everything's gonna be great.
Well, thank you all so much for the questions, and let's give a round of applause to our panel.
Thank you.